Tom Chamberlin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
The Rake is the modern voice of classical elegance. What does that mean?
I think that there is a place in a lot of guys' imaginations of a world where sort of things like money and taste aligned. I think that there was a time where men dressed in a certain way, presented themselves in a certain way, and had certain values that I think that it's still around today, but isn't really encapsulated by much, except for when certain films come out or whatever. So I think the modern voice of classic elegance is all about reminding and sort of educating people in a sort of set of values and a certain aesthetic and a certain set of sartorial rules that are considered old hat or antediluvian, but actually have a really broad audience. And I think that that's reflected in the growth of the Rake and the success of it.
On your website, that the Rake provides incisive, in-depth commentary on menswear and many other elements of gentlemanly living, from manners and ethics to art, design, travel, the intellectual and the philosophical, entertainment, food and drink. You could imagine now if you pitched that idea to investors, you might not get very far. So how did the concept of the Rake magazine come about?
Just out of interest, why do you not think we would get that far?
Well, I was hoping, in true podcast style, that was an open question.
I tend to be the one who asks the questions as a journalist.
Well, if you ask me personally, I would say that they weren't, given that I'm wearing my linen Ralph Lauren suit in order to interview the editor of The Rake, but I wanted to hear it from your point of view.
And here am I in my cardigan and shirt. So The Rake is 15 years old. It's, and I've only been there 9. And the concept of it came up with basically the founder is a guy called Wade Coe, amazing guy. Now he was turning 40 in 2008. And he sort of felt like all the magazines that were out there, the men's magazines, didn't reflect and didn't represent guys his age. It sort of felt like if you were, if you had a six-pack and if you were young and you wore your sort of jeans really low and stuff, that's what made you cool and that's what made you relevant. Whereas he grew up in a world where Cary Grant and Humphrey Bogart were cool. And you don't think of Humphrey Bogart and Cary Grant as cool in their 20s. You think of them as cool in their 40s and 50s. And so he was like, well, who's talking about that? Who is the voice for that? And who's creating the community of people who align with that? And there wasn't really anything. And so that's how the concept of the Rake came along, because he had success with a magazine called Revolution, which is sort of still the biggest watch magazine in the world. And the idea behind Revolution, the reason it was successful, was giving it a kind of lifestyle side to it, sort of putting watches not just as a great mechanical work of art, but ultimately something that can fit into people's lives. And the Rake became a sort of a bigger extension of that, because ultimately we are a luxury lifestyle magazine. So it works with kind of anything. And so you could be talking about any sort of subject. There's always a quote unquote rakish element to it that you can talk about.
And you said there that you've been with the Rake for 9 years, and you became an editor at quite a young age. What was your background and story leading up to taking the helm of the Rake?
So you are right. I was fairly young. I had worked, however, for a man named Nick Fowles for many, many years. And Nick is, I would still say, the kind of the most influential and authoritative voice on men's luxury in the world. And that could be anything from watches to tailoring to anything. If you've got Nick writing for you, if you've got Nick saying something on a subject, then it's certainly worth listening to. And he is a very exacting and a very knowledgeable academic. He's a brilliant man and a great journalist and a wonderful writer. And I worked for him for many years. And during that time, he was very, very generous with his his time, his education, or his capacity to educate. And we spent many years talking about all this stuff constantly. And I think that Way knew Nick and respected Nick and was friends with Nick. And it just sort of came about that the Rake was moving from Singapore to London, because it started in Singapore and it moved over to London to set up shop here, because the growth of the magazine was quite fast, and it just became something that was really popular in America and UK and stuff. And it was just difficult for the company, if they were in Singapore, to keep up with everything, because they were sending magazines to America, which from Singapore is a very expensive setup. So they decided they needed to kind of have something that was central GMT and also structured to the kind of standards of high quality magazine making that the UK is really well known for. So they opened up the office here, and Nick said to Way, "Tom is your guy, really." I went through a rather rigorous interview process with Way that was very long. And
what happened in the interview?
Way is an equally smart man. He's the son of a diplomat, and there was sort of the great diplomat from Singapore, a man named Tommy Koh, who engineered a huge amount of sort of 70s and 80s changes at the UN. So he was at the UN, and so he's a very famous man in Singapore for his work on the diplomatic scene. And I think Way certainly has inherited that. And so he's incredibly polite and incredibly gregarious and charismatic to talk to. But everything he says has a sort of, there is a sort of challenge set for anybody talking to him. You need to be on your game. You need to know your stuff. So he would suddenly switch from talking about a certain tailor to a certain watchmaker, and I would just need to keep up. I would need to give my opinions on things. He isn't interested in me, or he wasn't interested in me just sort of having, oh, that's very good or that's very bad. He wanted me to kind of be rigorous about my responses to him in the interview, and I weirdly think I was. I think I kept up. It was one of those times where I came out of an interview and I thought, actually, I think if I don't get it, I don't think I could have given much more. Actually, I think I did all right, which was nice. And then it turns out I did get it, so it was great. And I, it was one of those terrifying things where as you say, I was young and I sort of expected not really to pass my probation, but I sort of thought, well, tell you what, 3 months at the Rake will kind of give me a good springboard to something else. And so I was really wanting, it was my favorite magazine that was out there. So I was really signed up to its values and its aesthetic and its format. And so I hit the ground running in that sense, because I wasn't keen to change much. I wasn't really wanting to kind of do much more than they were already doing, because I think that what they were doing was brilliant. So that's when 2014 is when I started and hit the ground running. I was assigned a huge amount of stuff to sort of start doing, and my sort of editing career really started from there in terms of the administrative as well as the creative side of things.
So that's your journalistic career. What about before then? What made Tom Chamberlin interested in all of these different facets of life?
It's a good question. Probably my father, to a large extent. He and me share a lot of taste, and he's quite an old-fashioned sort of old cavalry officer, and always had like a beautiful shoe collection, and was, he started a health club in the city called Slim Jim's, which was set up as in 1970, and it was set up as a kind of officer's mess. So most people in the city in 1970 will have done national service at that point. So the idea was that it was a kind of reminder of the world of the officer's mess and the kind of coziness and also how fit you are when you're in the army. And then when you go down there, it was very tastefully done. My dad's a very tasteful guy. It's very tastefully done with Bateman cartoons on the wall and sort of military portraits and things like that. And I always really liked that. I always thought that I got a great sensation from it. And so really it kind of it came from him. And when I was at school, I was sort of the only one who wore a double-breasted suit, and I was the only one who wore sort of non-black Oxfords. And I there was always hints there that this is sort of a place to go. I don't think I identify myself as necessarily this is where I would go, but I think it's certainly when I reflect on it, the hints were certainly always there.
And with the rise now, if we come back to the modern age of casual dressing, you won't see, maybe not in the Rake's office, but in any given office, you won't see many suits. And the suits that you do see, people will be wearing with T-shirts and trainers. Is that something in which you lament, the casual dressing now of people in the workplace?
I'm on two minds on this, because what it does is it turns the suit into something of an occasion. It becomes a sartorial occasion in itself. So when you see it, I mean, have you seen Oppenheimer? Go watch Oppenheimer. It is the best dressed film of the last 10 years. And you see how special these clothes can be when done really well. And judging by the stories that have now been written about it, I'm not the only one who's noticed. So the kind of casualization of, whatever it is that COVID did or whatever, it turns the suit, or it turns sartorial dressing into more of an occasion. And that's, for me, a really great thing. I think because it sort of elevates, it's in an elevated position. So I sort of just don't think, and I don't see people going out in the evenings in a tracksuit. People leave behind their casual stuff at home when they're going to do something really nice. And I think that's a fine place for a suit to be. That's okay. It's okay that it's in a place where it comes out at an appropriate moment when people are looking to elevate what they're presenting to the world. And in the meantime, if they want to wear tracksuits, if they want to wear T-shirts, all power to them. It's okay. I don't. It's not really my style. I mean, look, as I'm sitting here with my cardigan on, but I enjoy dressing up like that, and I don't begrudge people who just necessarily don't. But I do think that a lot of people would still, if they're going to a wedding and stuff, understand that they need to up their game a bit.
So you mentioned Oppenheimer there. Do you think back then everyone just dressed better?
We do reflect on the interwar and sort of during the war and post-war periods as a very sartorial era. You think of Jesus of Worcester, and you think of those sorts of things where people did really look amazing. Now, these are costume departments even the Imitation Game, for example, was a beautifully dressed film. It was all about Enigma, but there was a lot of great knitwear and things like that. People were dressing like that a lot more, and you do see videos of people going into, Waterloo Station, and everybody's wearing a suit and everybody's wearing a hat, and that's great. That was just the way it was. But back then it was much easier. It was easier to get clothes like that, and it just isn't as easy nowadays to get good-looking clothes such as that. The proportions were much more different. I think that the glamour of the 20s, the real upper echelons of society, they would be really, really ostentatious with the proportions of their clothing, and that ultimately just sort of bled down during the war into sort of everybody wearing big lapels or wider trousers or longer pleats, and there was just a lot more of it. So the films, whether it's, if you watch The Crown, for example, nowadays, The Crown's great. I mean, because I don't really watch it anymore, but I loved those early episodes because you saw that period of time. But you saw how the costume department was having a real field day with these amazing looking clothes. And then now, as they sort of bleed into the 80s and stuff, it's all just a lot more boring, and it's not as fun. It doesn't look as great. And so it kind of encapsulates my point, which is that, it had its day. And I think the Rake, certainly, and I reflect on those days as real zeniths of dressing. And I think that anybody who is sort of a man who's interested in sartorial refinement and dressing up in a kind of a more classic way, think about the war and that period, and look at Pinterest and things to sort of find those sorts of clothes.
And what's your current taste when it comes to a suit? You mentioned that you were the only one in school wearing a double-breasted, and you alluded to there the big lapels of the mid-war era. When you're going to commission a suit, what are you asking your tailor for?
Ultimately, my enjoyment of big lapels does also have a practical point to it. It's because I'm a big guy. I'm 6'4", and I used to row, so I'm quite broad-shouldered. So big lapels work for me because I'm broad and I'm tall, but it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. So, but yes, in terms of my personal taste, I do only wear double-breasted, really. I haven't worn single-breasted for a very long time, and it just works for me in a way that I like, and I love the aesthetic. I like the sort of calmed inner self-consciousness of a sort of guy with a dad bod. The double-breasted conceals a lot of ills in that sense. And I am, I feel like I'm at my best when I'm wearing a suit and tie, and when it's sort of beautifully made. I love tweed, so I like heavier fabrics because it just sits nicer on me, and it's tougher to crease. So that's why I like things like tweed, because I just think it works for that sort of military silhouette that I quite like. So a stronger shoulder, nipped in at the waist, and nice long jacket. That's my preference. Because I've got long legs, so I don't like tight trousers. So I like sort of a wider base on the trousers with turn up or not. And in terms of shoes, I'm a great advocate for highly polished shoes, any shoes.
Alexander Kraft says no one should ever wear black Oxfords, always wear at least a brown shoe of any kind. Is that a diagnosis in which you would agree?
No.
Why?
Brown is a very nice colour to wear for a shoe, but you wear it with something like grey. And I think that, some people can pull off brown. It's a very Alexander Kraft thing to say, because it works for him, and so therefore it must work for everybody. But it doesn't. It doesn't work for everybody. And so, God bless Alexander Kraft. It's an individual thing. For example, I can't wear things like brogues because I have really big feet. So my feet are just too big, and there's too much leather going on for me to really wear them. So I pick carefully. And, for example, what's he going to do at Ascot? Because you can't wear brown shoes at Ascot. You don't wear brown shoes with morning dress. You don't wear brown shoes with a dinner jacket. You should wear black with a navy suit. That is ask Nick Fowkes. That's what Nick Fowkes does. And I think Nick is the great benchmark for what is tasteful and what is not. And my tutelage really for style is, except for obviously because my dad's he's quite old fashioned. So my dad just sticks to what's acceptable in the officer's mess, which isn't necessarily what I would term as stylish, but it's just traditional. Whereas Nick Fowkes does things that are incredibly tasteful, but adventurous and authentic to his personality. So I also do like burgundy loafers, for example. And so, I think burgundy shoes are really nice with grey. They can look nice with navy. Depends on the navy. I mean, there's a lot of dark blues out there, and that's the thing, is that some dark blues works or some it doesn't. But polish them. The key is polish the bloody shoes.
As well as polishing shoes, you're also a big advocate for luxury watches. What does your current personal selection look like?
I have a nice selection of a couple of watches, and I have ones that are appropriate for different outfits. So a Shiro Perigo 1966 that works really nicely for either for a suit or in the evening as a dress watch. I have a Longines Tuxedo Heritage, which is the same. Could work for anything. But I also have like a, Ben & Ross belly tanker, which is I usually wear with kind of more casual outfits, and it's brown as well, so maybe for the countryside too. I've got a heap of them. I've even got quite an eccentric Tudor Black Bay heritage with the red bezel, which is my wife for our leather anniversary got me a leather alligator strap with the matching colour, so that matches the colour of the bezel. So if I ever want to wear a lot of red, I bring that up. But watches are great. Watches are great things. Watches are not as hard to get one's head around as I think people think, because people see the price point and they balk, and I understand why they would, because some of these watches are incredibly expensive. But when you consider the fact that these are works of art, these are engineering achievements that excel a lot of architecture and a lot of science that happens today. Watches can sit on the same table as great artistic and architectural endeavors, because what it does to harness physics, engineering, chemistry, sometimes gravity. It's pretty exceptional what these people do without the aid of an electrical socket.
But if one was to play devil's advocate with that statement that you said, if we take an Apple Watch, for example, and I will forgive you if you balk, an Apple Watch, for example, is a tenth of the price of some of these luxury watches. It has 10 times the features. So a Patek, for example, it won't tell your heart rate, it won't take calls, but it certainly doesn't have Google Maps. So what would you say to that?
People don't buy mechanical watches because they want to know their heartbeat. When did you first buy an Apple Watch?
I first bought an Apple Watch about 4 years ago. I've had to replace it. Yeah.
Interesting.
So, case in point.
Okay, so you're closing the gap. You're closing the gap between how much you spent on an Apple Watch versus how much you spent on a mechanical watch. And my guess is that within 10 years' time or 12 years' time, you would have had to replace it a couple more times. And you're closing the gap even more. And the guy who's bought the watch that is 10 times the Apple Watch is still got that watch, would be my guess.
I believe in, if we were in a court case, that would be case closed. Because my grandmother, for my 21st birthday, she purchased for me a Tudor Black Bay heritage. It has as yet, and I'm sure that it won't break down at any point.
It's a great watch. And the thing is that I think less and less people buy great mechanical watches to tell the time. What they do is they're buying a piece of art that is able to monitor the passing of time in a way that is exceptional. And it's quite reductive that people are like, you're just buying something to tell the time when you have your phone. And I think that people are using their phone to tell the time and look at the time. They buy a watch because they understand the value of having something extraordinary, and the joy that comes with that, and the story that it can tell, and also, frankly, the value that it holds in comparison to an Apple Watch. Apple do wonderful products, and I'm currently logged in on here using an Apple product. I have nothing against Apple, and so don't get in trouble with Apple, basically.
Moving on from watches to suits, yeah. I would like to ask you for your advice for, say, someone is in the market for a new suit. Say they've gone through the era of skinny fitting prom suits, now in the market for a good quality suit. They have a healthy budget, but it's not endless. What 3 things should they be looking for when purchasing this suit?
You've taken one of my 3 things which you have to know. Firstly, budget. Budget is key. Know what your budget is and work with that. It's the first thing. Whenever anyone asks me for advice on a watch or a suit, the first thing I say is, what's your budget? And I want people to be honest. It doesn't matter. I don't think people shouldn't be embarrassed about that. They just need to know. So, because there are options on the table. The second thing to know is what you need to be buying it for. So, are you going to be using it for work? Are you going to be using it to go on dates? Are you going to be using it for whatever? It's good to know that, because within that, things like fabric choice and cut come into the mix. Because, for example, if you're going to be commuting every day in this suit, you want something that's harder wearing, because you're going to be getting on and off the tube. You're going to be, getting up and going to meetings. You're going to be wanting to look great. So a slightly hardier fabric that creases a lot less than like linen or a summer weight suit is going to be preferable. And so always think carefully about what it is that you would be buying this for, what you want to be using it for, and where you will be using it to express yourself to the world. And the third thing I would fabric comes into it, so provenance in terms of sort of where the fabric's coming from. Because if you want to be spending money, you want to be spending it wisely. So someone like Suit Supply is really great, because Suit Supply does a really great value proposition for people who wanted to buy suits. And they do actually look really nice. They come out looking great, and there's a level of personalization that I think makes people feel like they're getting something special for themselves without necessarily breaking the bank. But crucially, they work really well with the great fabric mills. And so they did a thing with Vitale Barberis Canonico, for example. And, Vitale Barberis Canonico are one of the great Italian mills, and they produce really beautiful fabrics. But what's important about that is that you are helping, if your mind is on things like sustainability, environmental friendliness, and ethical processes, then great fabrics do come into that, because how fabrics are made very much are calculated in how long they last, and how much of a kind of carbon footprint you're leaving, or whether you're sort of funding child slavery abroad, etc., etc.
And then on the flip side, what things would you advise avoiding when it comes to buying a suit?
Well, you got to look at fit. So when you put it on, you need to make sure it fits you. Don't buy something that doesn't fit. Lots of ready-to-wear stuff doesn't fit you. These brands make things of certain of various blocks, which means that depending on what size you are, they could throw off the balance of the whole thing. You won't look the way you think you want to look, because most people will go and buy a suit because they've seen James Bond, or they've seen The Crown, or they've seen Oppenheimer. They've seen it and they think, actually, I could do with that in my life. That would be really cool if I could kind of pull that kind of look off. And then you go to these places and buy, and it won't necessarily have the kind of desired effect that you're after. So experiment a bit. I think places like Ralph Lauren are really good at providing a good breadth of suiting and that fits people, works for people, because they're really conscious about things like sort of the waist and the length of the jacket. So I think that, don't, like with a kind of house, don't necessarily just go with the first thing you come across. And I think that there is also, understand what's traditional, because I think that things that are traditional are going to be around longer than the things that are fashionable, and that's why they're traditional. So, for example, I think the single-breasted jacket with the peak lapel it was very popular years ago, especially when Tom Ford was first coming out. It was a huge thing, and it was based on the whole Tommy Nutter, Edward Sexton designs, But if it isn't a Tommy Nutter and Edward Sexton thing, don't bother. But it is going to, it's a fad. I don't think it's going to last much longer, and you are going to sort of end up having something in your wardrobe that you're like, actually, I don't really want to wear that anymore. Whereas if you've got something that's a traditional notched lapel and a single-breasted jacket with the right lapel width and stuff, you will always love it.
And talk me through the accessorizing of a suit. Say the chap who's now bought a suit, he's looking to accessorize it with cufflinks and pocket squares. Do you have any advice in which you would pass on in that department?
Yeah, don't just buy stuff you like, build a wardrobe. It's kind of like, do you play backgammon? Right, well, the concentration of backgammon is always about building your board, about kind of creating those sort of safety places, and you build on that. You don't sort of, not each bit isn't just sort of a rogue piece to get around the board. You got to all play together, and I think that that's true with your wardrobe as well. You build your wardrobe. You don't just see something in a shop and say, that's really nice, I've got to get that. You got to think about whether it works with other stuff that already exists. So if you see a pocket square you really like, does it go with a tie that you already have? Because if it doesn't, I would recommend that you should keep looking for a pocket square that does, and you will find something. And whether you like it more or not, I promise you, when you put it all together, you will prefer the effect that it has. So color coordination is really important. I did a TikTok on this recently but one of the rules I wanted to bust on dressing was the not mixing patterns, because I think that's bunkum. I think that the pattern mixing is totally fine. It's just about, I think color coordination is really important. and if you're able to kind of do it and it all works, people do spot it. You'd be amazed.
A lot of this comes from the brands in which you write and you wear, which fall under the luxury category. But with premium quality comes a premium price point. What advice would you give to people who are as yet unable to afford these items and brands?
Still watch everything that I do. I think don't feel like I'm going to be a snob because you're buying a lovely cashmere jumper from Uniqlo rather than Brunello Cucinelli, because I think Uniqlo cashmere jumpers are amazing and they do amazing colorways, and so there are always options. I think that you don't have to necessarily break the bank with this stuff. As I say, coordinating colors isn't necessarily an expensive endeavor. You need to buy a couple of things, but it's not necessarily an expensive endeavor. You don't need to sort of bespeak a tie or pocket square, but you can get that jacket from, Polo Ralph Lauren. Polo Ralph Lauren's not expensive. I mean, it's more expensive than, actually, I don't know if it is more expensive than Reiss, actually, but it's more expensive than some brands, but it's not necessarily, in comparison to Purple Label, in comparison to Brunello Cucinelli, in comparison to Loro Piana. Yeah, this stuff is very expensive. But there are options. You've got to look. Vintage, try vintage. I think that, there's Vinted. The app, this is opening up a whole new world to people who aren't necessarily going to be able to check in on every season that Brunello Cucinelli comes out with. The Brunello Cucinelli does wonderful clothes, but it doesn't mean that there's any problem with going to somewhere like Vinted and checking out what's on the vintage market, because vintage shops are becoming fewer. There are fewer and fewer of them. And so, but you have to kind of be in proximity to them to visit them. And then something needs to fit. The internet's now gotten involved, and the market's broadened out a whole load, much more with women's, and that's always going to be the case. But now you might go on somewhere like Vinted and find something you actually really want, and for a reasonable price. So, don't lose faith, don't lose heart. I think that if you like stuff that the Rake talks about, or that I talk about on TikTok or whatever, definitely don't feel like it's not for you just because yes, I talk about the luxury industry, because the rules can apply across the board. And, DM me if you need advice. I'm pretty good with getting back to people.
Ian Fleming once wrote that James Bond thought that anyone who wore a Windsor knot was a bit of a cad, and you yourself never do, opting for the 4-in-hand knot. Why is that?
Ian Fleming was a massive snob. So I'm not surprised he would have put something like that down. It's great when authors put their own personal opinion into something that ultimately becomes a massive style icon. Some great people I know who wear the Windsor knot. So Paul Feig, Eddie Sahakian, two brilliantly dressed men. And so I think everything's about proportion. And I think that there are certain knots that just won't work for me. And I think that I've always been conscious of being neater because I'm big. So neater shoes because I've got big feet. Neater waist because I've got broad shoulders and need to look like it all comes in together. Neater tie. Lapels are a bit of a different story, but ultimately lapels have everything to do with head shape. So if you have a big head like mine, you want wider lapels, because if you have small lapels, it makes your head look even bigger. It's just an optical thing. So the same can be said ultimately for sort of Windsor knot ties. I like the 4-in-hand because it just has a kind of an elegance about it and a sort of a neatness to it that fits to my sartorial needs.
You touched on there how lapels is an optical thing. What other optical things can people be aware of when dressing themselves?
The waist underneath the shoe. So if a shoe is waisted, it sort of elongates the silhouette. So if you've got really wide feet or really long feet, it can kind of absolutely change how people perceive it, just because of the way the waist tucks in underneath the shoe. So what you do is you to pick up the shoe and look on the inside, because that's where the tuck is. It's not on the outside; it's on the inside of the shoe, and just look at how much the sole kind of curves in. And the way it's sort of cut in. You often won't get this from most shoemaking, but there are sort of great shoemakers like Graziano and Girling and Edward Green, who make really good efforts on something like this. What Cleverly's good at too, Cleverly has that famous sort of what they call suspiciously square toe, that again isn't squaring off the shoe, but it creates a sense of elegance towards the front of the shoe. The other things are, so your jacket length should sit on the bottom of what we call the seat, so which is basically the end, the bottom of your bottom. That's where it should be sitting, so it should entirely cover it. Don't let it go any further up. If you're showing any of that, I mean, it looks terrible. It doesn't look good at all. And so just those extra inches, it makes all the difference for making sure that you seem everything sort of balanced beautifully. Pleats beautifully add to the silhouette of any outfit. So if you can see pleats and they're there, it does enhance that hourglass figure that everybody, I think, looks for when they're wearing nice clothes. Everything else is sort of personalization, really, about what a tailor can do and can't do.
In the last few years, especially in the fast fashion world, when it comes to suits, there's been a real trend towards a short jacket and skinny lapels. Every time you see one of them, do you just want to cry?
No, but I don't like it. But as I say, I have to be, just to be clear, I sound like a snob, but I'm not a snob. So I'm fine with people doing what it is they want. It just isn't for me. And I try not to be an elitist about these things. I just think that there is a lane that I have and that I'm in and that I work within, and I understand it and I know it. And if people want to step outside of that and do other things, that's fine. I don't think it looks as nice, but that's totally. I would never tell them that because we're all self-conscious enough in this world. And I think that the skinny tie, skinny child thing, I think that's going a bit. I think actually when you look at stuff in the ready-to-wear collections, you'll see better proportioned clothing out and about these days, which is encouraging, because I think that anything that used to be, anything that was unfashionable will once again become fashionable. So in 5 years' time, we check it again. Maybe they'll come back again, the skinny lapel, skinny tie thing. A lot of the time, this stuff is a cost-saving exercise. So you cut thin the lapels, you save on fabric. You cut shorter jackets, you save on fabric. So it's a shame. It's a great shame when they do that. I think that's more of a shame than when people actually identify it as their personal expression of style.
If the British government created a new department, a department for sartorial elegance, and appointed you minister, what would you do with all of your new powers?
I would give Savile Row a great big fat business break, because I think it's a heritage site. I think that we need to protect these things. I think that it's really nice that you find some tailors who are setting up shop in Shoreditch or wherever. But ultimately, for most of these people, their heart lies in Savile Row, because that's where they trained or where they would really like to be. And so when you protect crafts which are endangered, and I would say this day for shirt making, shoe making, the lot. So actually Savile Row is a bit of a sort of an unfair minimalisation of actually the breadth of craftsmanship in this country. So brands like Swain Aidley Brigg, brands like Alexander Llewellyn, who makes these amazing backgammon boards, brands like Lock & Co. These which are rooted in craftsmanship, which are rooted in somebody with a great skill set that they've dedicated their life and passion and talent to learning, is then offered to you as a customer. That's an amazing thing, because these people will then pour all that skill into this garment for you. It is a dying art. It is I think something, however, that we as a country culturally are very aligned to. And so I would look to protect that if I were offered the job. And I sort of hope they do offer me the job.
So what else would you do?
I don't know. I think that's a good day's work, don't you? I'd spend a lot of my time sort of promoting. I mean, and to some extent, it's just an extension of what we do at the Rake. It's a sales job. It's a promotional job to keep the sense that these places are relevant, because I do believe that they are, and I think they're too easily dismissed as not being it because they're slow, because they take time and they they aren't instant gratification. And so I would work on ways to help the sense that they are still relevant and the messaging around that. As I say, in a way, I guess that's my job here at The Rake, is to do that, and that's what I try and do to some extent on TikTok. I don't know whether successfully or not, but that is what I do. With the hope that a next generation is curious enough about it to perhaps explore it. I don't. People always, and I get a lot of stick on TikTok because people sort of say this is out of touch, this is expensive. There are food banks and other things, and I have great sympathy for all that to a large extent. But I'm not making content for rich people. I'm making content for curious people. I think these stories are interesting, and I think these stories are inspiring to a large extent, especially when you consider the kind of the backgrounds of a lot of the people who do want to become shoemakers and tailors and stuff. I'm not talking about people who are born into sort of public schooling and things. There is a great, tale to be told here. I mean, even Marx was keen on the artisan as a protected. The artisan, as far as Marx was concerned, was allowed to make as much money as it could because there was a lot of value to being someone with that much skill. I've always had the belief that these stories retain a romance and a value culturally to the nation that I would want to be promoting.
You said that luxury for me is a bridge between art and practicality. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean that ultimately people tend to buy luxury goods because they actually provide something in their lives. Like they make them warmer, or you wear them on your feet. You put it on your head, or I don't know, you wear the spectacles or something. They have a practical application in your life, but they are made in a way that is artistic. That's the thing. They aren't lazy products. They are, and often by hand. I mean, and the thing is that there's no argument that this stuff isn't popular because the richest man in the world is the richest man in the world because he owns companies that make things by hand. It's silly to think that this is an irrelevant thing. People are connected to this idea that other humans are pouring their talent into making something. But it's extraordinarily romantic, and so that bridge, that ultimate bridge between art, which is sometimes a vacuous, sometimes a concept that is incredibly complex to pin down what makes art. And then you find sort of, a hole in your life, a practical application in your life that is required, which is, for example, wearing shoes. Wearing shoes, everybody wears shoes. It's a very practical thing to be doing. We all need shoes. And, shoemakers make these extraordinary things that are ultimately going to be destroyed because people put them on their feet and they walk out on the pavement in them. But these things should be mounted on a wall because they are just such exquisite things. They are made with unbelievable skill, with the most amazing fabrics and techniques, which are some are ancient, and they really root us in our sort of species's. Craftsmanship was one of the first things we were. Making tools was the thing that we did when we were still Neanderthals. That's what we did. So making stuff is at the very essence of the human story. It's a bit large to say, it's a bit much to say that the luxury industry is therefore a descendant of that. When you take that and then bridge it with art, you bridge the two. That's what the luxury industry is about. It's about creating that connection between that which is beautiful and that which is practical.
What can we expect from Tom Chamberlin in the near future?
Oh, God, I dread to think.
I didn't know that would be the most difficult question of the whole episode.
I'm writing a book. I can't tell you what the book's about, but I'm writing a book. And more. You can expect more. I'm 36. I'm not really done yet. I've got a lot of stuff that I want to do. I love The Rake, and so I love making it. And every time the 15th anniversary issue is in October. Depending when this goes out, it could be before or after, I'm not sure. That's a great milestone for a magazine, and it's a magazine that's successful. It's a magazine that actually, makes money, and we are, that's a very exciting thing. So I am, not sure necessarily what it is that I can promise, that people can expect. But, hopefully whatever it is, people like it.
And where can people find you?
You can find me taking various peregrinations around the streets of Mayfair, or I'm on Instagram and TikTok on @TF Chamberlin.
Tom Chamberlin, thanks for coming on the show.
You're a delight. Thank you very much.